Herb Boyd is an award-winning author and journalist. He has published 22 books and many, many articles at the national and international level. I'm not going to give you a litany. I will tell you he has a website. You can go on it and find it out for yourself. But I will say to you that he has been associated with a series of unbowed people pushing the envelope, trying to get messages not only across to the people who are our opposition, but people on our side, to get bone, to get courage, to get the desire to move forward. And in that particular motif is Malcom X, who rises literally like a beacon. And any of you who were around New York in the 60s, you have your own stories. And when we started listening or hearing about the Marable book, which we thought we should bring forward because in the, well, just in terms of intellectual honesty, you don't ignore what somebody is saying, whether you like it or don't like it. You become knowledgeable about it, and then you refute it. But then we were glad to hear that Herb Boyd and a series of other people had written a response. And with that, I am going to now introduce you to Herb Boyd with a response.
Thank you. Right. Do not speak to me of martyrdom, of men who died to be remembered on some parish day. I don't believe in dying, though I too will die. And like the flowers, the violets, like castanets, they will echo me. Yet this man, this genius, the one who has cheered us forward, thick-lipped with words, will no longer speak again. Those words, the opening stanzas that Sonia Sanchez wrote back in 1968 in a book called For Malcolm that was edited by the late Dudley Randall and Margaret Burroughs. Dudley Randall was the founder of Broadside Press in Detroit, Michigan, my hometown. I always like to say that Detroit, Muriel, is where my soul is, and New York is where my spirit is. Margaret Burroughs, she died 2 years ago. She was a founder of the DuSable Museum, one of the outstanding museums in this country. Dudley died in the year 2000, and I always remember him as a mentor, and his most famous poem is about Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. You know, it seems to me, says Booker T. I don't agree, says W.E.B. Pretty much summarized the kind of tension between those two individuals. But he was an outstanding poet, a word warrior of the highest order, and the founder of Broadside Press. And if you want to get more on him, there's a very fine documentary out there called The Black Unicorn that you can get, a very fine work. I say that poem because it's also a poem that we utilize at the beginning of By Any Means Necessary, because it sets a certain kind of tone for us. I do believe that the whole spirit of Malcolm and what he represented during his short tenure. And you think 39 years is very brief, exceedingly brief, particularly when you get as old as, well, anyway. Since I've been here so long, some of my students think I knew Frederick Douglass. First name basis, with Abraham Lincoln, Of course, Lincoln never invited me to the White House. Obama did. But anyway, it sets a certain kind of tone for us. And so we asked permission to use it again. So that's the opening poem in the book. And thereafter, Muriel, you have just a flood of information coming about in it's kind of critical conversations. You'll notice the title is By Any Means Necessary, but it also has a subtitle, Malcolm X Real, Not Reinvented. And of course, the impetus on that word, reinvented. And many of the contributors, there's 35 contributors in this book. And just to contextualize it a bit, it really goes back to, it actually goes back to 1968 when you start talking about how these responses are gathered by African-American public intellectuals and scholars and activists. William Styron put a book out then called The Confessions of Nat Turner. And it caused quite an uproar in a similar fashion to what Manning has done here with this book among black intellectuals and thinkers. And Dr. John Henry Clark, my mentor, brought together a number of respondents. And the book was called 10 Black Writers Respond to William Styron's Confessions of Nat Turner. So in other words, some precedent had been established in terms of reacting to stuff out there. Of course, this was by no means the first time, but it's certainly a collective, the first time you had a solid collective of African-American writers, Muriel, to respond to a particular book out there they considered to be absolutely demeaning, reprehensible, and particularly in terms of meditations on history is what Styron called it. And we call it messing with our history, as he did. Even though at the time he was doing the book, James Baldwin, one of my heroes, was in residence with him temporarily. And he eventually, ultimately endorsed the book. But we'll talk about that later, particularly James Baldwin. And so after that, 2 years ago, pretty much about the same time of year we are going through right now, I think it was pretty much moving into the spring of 2010, and Henry Louis Gates, he wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times. It was called Ending the Slavery Blame Game, in which he said that almost 90% of the slaves, trafficked on the Atlantic, across the Atlantic Ocean was facilitated, by the African chiefs and other Africans, which was an astonishing number for us. And I immediately wrote a response in terms of how he's shifting the blame around and pretty much taking the European traders, from out from under the hammer. We were trying to smash him all the time on that, but he said, no, the Africans was complicit in this. But we're always concerned about to what extent they were complicit in terms of receiving, the benefits of that. And of course, subsequently, when you move into the dark days of the plantation and slavery in this country, we know full well who the beneficiaries were. But nonetheless, after that letter to the editor that I wrote to the New York Times, a number of people called me up, and so I began to talk to people like Dr. Ron Daniels and Dr. Maulana Karenga and Dr. Hakeem Madhubuti. It's always good to surround yourself with all these doctors, huh? And we started a conversation on how we're going to respond to that. In other words, set the record straight. The problem with that is that there were really nothing that had been written. So you had to commission pieces, and therein lies the rub. So it never